晚上好，欢迎您观看由服务器艺术出品、呼吸公社云饭局隆重推出的当代影像路径及其可能跨学科系列研讨。当代影像路径及其可能系列线上研讨，既是对当代艺术现有路径的分析与研究，更是对其在 AI 时代各种可能性的探讨。我们特邀在当代艺术摄影、哲学、神经美学、认知科学等领域有独到研究的专家学者组成策划委员会，每期邀请2到3位嘉宾，针对当代影像路径及其可能的不同主题展开探讨。本期将针对摄影如魔术这一主题展开分享与研讨。接下来，我们有请今晚的主持人、艺术理论家、独立策展人、呼吸公社社长藏策老师。有请藏策老师。
大家晚上好，我是今天的主持人藏策，欢迎大家来到呼吸公社云饭局。今天是当代影像路径及其可能跨学科系列研讨的第20期，分享的主题呢是摄影如魔术。今天呢，我们非常的荣幸的邀请到了3位呢参加我们研讨的嘉宾。对这个今天的摄影所面临的问题进行呢分享和讨论。我们的这个特邀嘉宾是国际著名的当代摄影评论家、策展人夏略特·科顿女士。那么我们今天呢，又这个语坛嘉宾又非常荣幸的请到了我们的这个节目的老朋友，这个评论家、策展人、摄影家姜蓉老师。和复旦大学哲学学院艺术哲学系的博士候选人，也是呢摄影理论避难所社群联合的创办者陈国森老师。那么呢，现在几位老师呢，跟大家呢先跟观众打个招呼。好，观众朋友们好，
观众朋友们好，
几位嘉宾好。那么这个我们国内呢，这个大家呢对科顿女士呢应该是比较熟悉的了，因为呢现在在我手里头呢就是拿着她的这本我们中文版的书，大家应该呢关心摄影理论以及对当代摄影有兴趣的朋友，应该都对她这本书很熟悉了。这本书呢在这个中国的影响是非常大的。那么这个科顿女士呢，实际上还有另外一本书叫《摄影如魔术》。那么这本书呢，也就是我们今天对这本书，就是姜蓉老师现在拿这本书，它呢是这个也是我们今天的研讨的这个主题，就定在了这本书。为什么呢？因为呢，这本书，它这2本书都是对这个近几十年来这个我们整个这个世界的当代摄影的发展。进行了非常详细的、非常的这个有学术深度的梳理。那么呢，这2本书出版之后，现在呢又有10年过去了。那么这个整个我们世界的这个影像啊，又经历了一轮巨变，尤其是这个生成式 AI 这种在不需要相机、不需要镜头这样这种生成这样的一种，但是它又像照片一样的这样的一种影像，面对的今天这样一种发展。那么我们呢，非常的想听听，科顿女士，在今天她对我们今天所面临的这样一种发展，那么我们呢，非常的想听听，科顿女士，她那个有哪些见解？好，下面呢就下面呢有哪些见解？下面呢我们就有请科顿老师给我们进行今天的主题分享。好，有请科顿老师。
Thank you so much. It's really wonderful to be here. I've prepared a few words, no pictures, just to set the context for me joining you today and where I'm at creatively and intellectually and also emotionally. And I've prepared some words for you, which I've returned to my feelings about and the context of attending and speaking at the Society for Photographic Education at their annual conference this year in Atlanta, Georgia. And my remarks to the society were called What I Learn from You, which is a general thematic of my intellectual life at the moment, which is a reminder that we are all educators and also students. Each of us have both of those capacities. And I was there at the SPE conference in March, thanks to the recommendation of a photographer and educator called Jennings Sheffield, who in turn then recommended me to the organising committee member, Brett Koluski, who's based in Minneapolis. I say this just as a reminder that our creative lives are really dependent on the people that we keep close and we collaborate with. And Brett and I spoke regularly over the course of the past year before the conference about the shaping of the convening and what was being proposed as the major topics of conversation for photographers and educators, as well as what was happening to him and his family and his community in Minneapolis at this troubling time in American civil history. I'm also happy to have met SPE's executive director, Tony Roberts, who's clearly an amazing woman and an already trusted member of the community of SPE as the organisation restructures and frankly has to find a way to survive. And Rong, I think of you with the same gratitude and for teaching me and for inviting me today. You remind me of some of the phrases that I put on little post-it notes, which such as always remember those you connect to and who bring you joy, and say yes when they ask you to do something. What I'm in the process of relearning from you and others is the togetherness of face-to-face, in-person participation on and offline. And I appreciate being in a place that quietly honours the fortitude that it takes us all to juggle education, organisational and cultural projects and our individual lives with ongoing research and creative growth. I learn from and with everyone about what it is taking for each of us to hold our own ground. At every turn in my present-day life in photography, I see photographers supporting photographers and turning up for each other, cognizant of the reality checks we all face in this mercurial world, mindful of each other's contexts and starting point to join the exchange. I am currently learning that we are in this together, as we are here now, and I will not turn away from the generous reality checks and exchanges that you will bring into this space today. I am reminded of the enduring whispered chants of the photo community for generations, for which I still have great affection. Number one, how are we going to get the money to do what we want to do? Number two, how do we bear witness to what is unfolding now in our lives and our communities? Number three, how will we carry our histories forward and also safeguard our human agency? How do we learn not to be defeated and to make claim on whatever urgently needs to be taken forward? We are in a time that could totally floor us, and the best way to be at such a time is to participate in the real exchange. So thank you for inviting me into your discussion today.
好，谢谢科顿女士刚才的这个介绍和这个对她的工作非常有价值的工作的这个介绍。那么下面是不是有请科顿女士呢继续就今天要分享的学术的主题与我们中国的听众进行一下更加深度的分享，好吗？ 好，谢谢。
Can you repeat the question? Forgive me.
嗯
Yeah.
嗯
What
江
would you
老师，
like to
您
know
开
the
麦。
context in which I wrote Photography is Magic? Yeah.
你看看
Thank you for
来，thank you.
starting with Photography is Magic. I really appreciate that because often most people know me for the photograph as contemporary art, as the kind of reader of photography as art in the 21st century. And in many ways, Photography is Magic is a more personal project for me. So I'm always really touched when somebody wants to talk about Photography is Magic with me. The project began in about 2010 for me, and the book was finally published in 2015. And it marks, to give you context for what I was thinking about broadly and where I was in my own life when this book happened. I had just returned to the United Kingdom from my first period of living in America, where I have lived for most of the last 20 years. And I returned to England to be creative director at London Science Museum. And I was really thinking through the possibilities, the very optimistic possibilities of creative industry and image making in the 2010s, and thinking about a museum that could talk beyond art about image culture at this highly technological moment. But when I came back to the United Kingdom, I actually met the beginnings of the impact of the financial crash of 2008, and including its impact on education and creative labour. I was also conscious of the wholesale privatisation of higher education in the United Kingdom, which was a very different situation from when, because I'm so old, I actually got grants, fees paid for my higher education when I went to university. And it was the beginnings of that categorically being over, and the choices for young creative people being very different in the United Kingdom from anything we had experienced before. And as somebody who was very cautious of debt through education, Photography is Magic was like my love letter to the future of what image making could be if you chose not to go into debt and have a lot of qualifications, but just went straight into creating images. So the strategy of the book was to create something that was very beautiful, very optimistic, and was a very liberal taking of over 80 international image makers and artists into one book. So it was less academic, it was less qualifying. It was unlike institutions that often might choose a handful, like half a dozen artists to represent a particular moment. And instead it was saying, look, this is happening here, 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 over there, everywhere. You saw a whole generation of artists leading that leading the creative flow, not waiting for institutions, not waiting for education to validate what they were doing, but just lots of creative energy happening all over the world. And so this book, Photography is Magic, was written for me if I had been 18 in 2012, which was to say the future is yours. Make what you want to make. There's all of these artists across the world. Some you will have heard of, some you will never have heard of up until this moment, but they show you that the path is already laid for you to have a creative life. It doesn't matter how much money you have, how much institution endorsement you have, you can be a creative person at this moment. And that's the book that I developed, which has got some criticism, but luckily it was a fast process that meant the book and a related biennial that was done in Daegu, South Korea, sort of reached an audience just at the moment where I think there was a real need to receive some optimism about what the future of being an image maker could be.
谢谢科顿女士对这个《摄影如魔术》她的那本著作的一个讲解和阐释。那么现在呢，我们这个嘉宾呢，开始和科顿女士呢讨论一些个就她的著作以及今天呢，摄影出现的一些个新的这些个我们需要思考的问题展开一些个讨论和提问。那么现在呢，我想就先有请姜蓉老师从姜蓉老师那里开始，谢谢。
非常感谢主持人赞策老师。刚才我在听，戈顿老师他在开场白里边的那一番令人感人肺腑的发言，真的是让我特别感激。戈顿老师在过去这将近30年边为这个当代摄影如何进入到当代艺术所做的各方面的研究、努力和探索，并且为世界各国的艺术家发声。而且呢，虽然我跟戈登老师的联络，是断断续续的，最早认识他是在2015年，对，2016年，当时他是被纽约国际摄影中心聘为驻地的策展人，策划了一个展览，叫做公共、私人、私下和秘密，就是探讨这个在当时技术各方面发展的很快的情况下，如何保护隐私的这个问题的展览。那么就是在2016年，也就是在10年前，我当时非常冒昧的去邀请了柯顿老师来做一次采访，他当时就非常热议的答应了，虽然他当时非常忙。所以呢，刚才他提到，就是我们都应该相互的支持，相互的扶持，在面对当下他刚才所提到的5大挑战的情况下，我们如何能相互的支持，这种的合作精神的确是令我特别的感动。因为呢，这一次其实柯顿老师也特别忙，他刚刚参加完伦敦摄影博览会，但是呢，当我们邀请他的时候，那就答应了，而且呢，今天就给我们做了这个对话，所以我代表呢中国的团队和所有在座的听众呢，向他首先表示感谢。这是第一点。第二点呢，就是刚才柯顿老师所说的这番话呢，不仅仅让我们想到他刚才主持人赞策老师提到的那2本书，作为当代艺术的照片和摄影如魔术这2本书，其实他还跟别人合作出版了另外一本书，也是非常重要的，叫做《没有不像的字》。那本书其实也是非常重要，那个也是他跟别人合作的一个见证。 那么今天呢，我们在这里一块来讨论，在当下摄影所面临的这么多问题的时候，我们大家应该如何来应对？我相信这也是观众特别感兴趣的一个话题。问，柯顿老师一个问题，就是我记得在2016年对您的采访的时候，您提出了一个词叫做 photographic 这个词，您说这个词是能够非常比较恰当的能够描述我们当下摄影所处在的一个状况。当时呢，说实在的，我还不是特别能够理解这个词的含义。10年前，当你提出来 photographic，那个时候我还不能够完全理解。后来你将这个话题变成了你作为当代艺术的照片这本书的第9个章节的标题，变成了 photographicness 摄影性这个词作为第9个章节的标题。那么我就想问您，就是在10年前的时候，那个时候应该说是艺术家像Blalock 这些等等那一代的艺术家被称为是后因特网时代的艺术家，他们的作品可以被称为是 photographic。那么今天我们可能是处在另外一个时代，是处在 AI generated culture 的这个时代。那么在这个时代里边呢，艺术家有哪些？您观察到有哪些艺术家的作品是真正面对我们当下这个 AI 所产生的文化的时代的作品，能不能跟我们大家分享一下？谢谢。
That is such a great question. So, shall I start with your beautiful kind of thoughts on photographicness and what that might mean today? Yes, so you're right that my writings about the photographic are connected to the 2010s and the post-internet artists, including Lucas Blaylock. Many of the artists who were in Photography is Magic and have subsequently become an additional chapter in the photograph as contemporary art. And you're correct in saying that post-internet, which we might consider actually a period of time, like in art history, we also consider contemporary or modern periods of time. Post-internet, I think, in a classic art historical sense, is that moment in time that of the 2000 to mid-2000s to the end of the 2010s. And then all bets are off and everything else in life comes into play. And so in terms of would I translate photographicness and the photographic into the present day, and into our relationship with AI, I would say I'm cautious to do that because AI is a very, very different, astoundingly large proposition. And, you know, even in the time that we've been talking about AI, we've been talking about AI and all of the other things that are attached to AI, that AI itself is a very overstretched term in the way that we can see that post-internet, because it was such a demanding terminology, stayed very narrow, like it stayed very specific and it stayed within essentially culture and art history. Whereas AI is everything in our lives, for a start. And one would say that AI, in terms of image making, is potentially a very small area of AI-ness or the effect of AI. I can tell you a little bit about my own relationship with AI that might help clarify what interests me about it, which is You mentioned the exhibition Public-Private Secret at ICP when you and I met, Rong, and you might remember that in the exhibition were a series of square screens that had these live, no-net curations of Twitter. And every 15 minutes, these curated sequences from Twitter, which was things like the other or transformation or morality tales, would update live in the exhibition. So these screens had a really big impact on how you read the history of photography and the boundaries and boundarylessness between our public and private selves. And I worked with a technologist on that side of the exhibition. His name is Mark Gooneem, and he lives in New York. And he's the person who, for the last 10 years, has been my friend. So when NFTs started happening, I'd call Mark and say, "Hey, Mark, are NFTs a Ponzi scheme?" And he'd say, "Yes, correct. Don't put too much effort into it." And it meant that every artist who would ask me, should I be making NFTs? I go, look, you have to make NFTs to understand NFTs, but if you're still making them in 6 months, I'm not talking to you. So he was just very helpful at cutting the kind of overexcitement at these new kind of toys and gadgets. AI is a completely different thing. And 3 years ago, my friend Mark called me and said, do you want to join a study group that's looking at human agency in the time of AI? And I was like, yes, please. And there was a group of people, technologists, people from music, people from film, me and Mark, who were like the pro artists. Artists rule, artists determine the future. And we sat and we looked and we read together and we looked at all of the news that was coming out. And we have done that for 3 years. And then we started working on a product which is about storytelling for AI, which I won't go into much detail, but I will tell you what I have learned about AI, which is we are in the very rudimentary steps. And the real challenge is going to be how we use AI to enable human agency rather than remove it. And we're interested in how you can go deeper with AI into your storytelling. Now, the massive difference with AI broadly in comparison to any other technology that we have had is not its complexity, but the fact that you as an individual can train AI to do whatever you specifically want it to do. If you're willing to put in the time, you can instruct AI to build code. You don't have to be a coder, to create your avatar, to create your assistant, to create your support, essentially. And so it means that you can, rather than the off-the-shelf model, which is what most people are using at the moment, we've got potentially a really interesting future where AI can, on a very individual level, give us more agency and spare us time in the ways that's best for us to go deeper with our ideas. It also means that creatively what I see is that we will increasingly say, well, for us, this group, we will say, well, I come from photography. What I do with that knowledge and that discipline of photography as an idea could be completely different than what you might expect. That the process of photography and image making has been radically upended. That you can make an image before you can have an idea. You can make an image before you have any kind of where you've really refined your own personal aesthetics or signature of how you want to make an image. You can make an image and then think about what it tells you and what the story is behind it. You can turn that image into a film. You can turn that image into an animation. You can write the novel that goes with that picture. So what I see is photography no longer being the end result, an image no longer being the end result, but it could be an early prompt for all the other ways that you create stories. So I'm excited about the fact that a musician can feed into AI a line of music and can get the structural understanding of what that line of music is if it were a character or if it were a play. And that someone like me can create a vignette or a kind of, I can bring together a cast, I can curate a cast of images together, and then AI can help me turn it into a piece of music or into a novel or into a play or into a film. So I am weirdly optimistic of AI because I have seen in these experiments and in the safety of a study group that it can create new ways of working, which, you know, I will be sad to see photography's consequential steps no longer being important. But I know that that's my discipline, that I think about the consequence of when I do this, and then I do this, and then I do this in this order, something magic happens called the photographic. And I think that that is applicable to creative processes within the world of AI. It's just not on the shelf yet.
Thank you. Thank you, Charlotte, for your initial reply to this big question, as you mentioned. If I may, before I turn the floor over to Guoseng, I'd like to ask you a follow-up question, which I think maybe will provide the basis for our further discussion today. So we also invite Fred Richkin to be on this forum to discuss his latest book, The Synthetic Eye, in which he posits a term called, as you know, as called photorealistic image. He believes that the image generated by AI is not photography, but it's photorealistic. So personally, I also been thinking about whether AI generated image is photography or photographic or not.
Yeah.
And I'm sure a lot of people among our audience today have been thinking about this topic or this question. So as you know, AI generated the image, they come from different sources of the images. It could be image of Picasso's painting. It could be image of medical images and or surveillance images. So it doesn't have brush stroke like a painting. It doesn't have pixels like the image created by digital photography. So my question to you is that do you really think AI generated image is photography or photographic, or it's actually an entirely new medium? Thank you.
Thank you. I'm embarrassed I haven't read Fred's new book, but I really like your description of that term, photorealist. So I'd be happy to say photorealist, like I was happy to say photographic. You know, that they feel like good terms. And I also emotionally share a desire to separate my beloved photography from image making in the realm and through generative AI, in the sense that in the last 6 years, maybe 10 years, I would say politically, I have fallen back in love with the idea of photography as the form of bearing witness to what is happening in your world and your community, to such an extent that I would actively fight to preserve the legitimacy of calling photography a medium of bearing witness. And that is, of course, not to say that a generative AI cannot be used in the process of bearing witness, particularly on the level of scale and reach and immediacy with which a story can be told through generative AI. But I don't think it's through the still image of generative AI. So I think there's this little catchment where photography meets AI and visual storytelling, which is the still image, the mid-journey of AI, right? And it's like I think you're right to say that's neither photography, but nor do I think it's what the reach of generative AI in terms of the production of powerful stories that speak to where we are and bear witness to where we are. Because I also believe that I can watch, an animation film which tells me more about what's happening in the world than an image in a newspaper or a media form, right? I think it can come from lots of angles, but the truth is that right now I would like to preserve within the category of photography the right to bear witness, to see what I see, not what I hallucinate, not what I imagine, but to see what I see as something worth preserving within photography. So in terms of the beginnings of my writing around AI, which is minimal, although I'm about to publish a lot more about image makers and how I think AI changes. There's a whole history of people who've made images in the late 20th century and early 21st century who were not photographers. Like there's a lot of people who make images who are not photographers. And as that material ages, it gets really interesting to look at it in relationship to AI and this terrain of being an image maker and being a storyteller in the 2020s into the 2030s. So I'm interested in saying, look, the challenge of photography is not that it bears witness to and it tells the truth of what's happening in our individual lives, and it has a relationship with a human vision that all is worth protecting and not losing at this moment or not selling into AI. But equally, that history was very much the preserve of single authorship. It always said that there was one person who took that picture. There was literally the white man behind the camera who was taking those pictures. And so it's like, let's not pretend we were this really open-ended space that recognized, that the canon was extremely diverse. Like it's taken us the remainder of the end of the 20th century and into the 21st century to admit that, you don't have to be Robert Frank or Cartier-Bresson to take a picture that tells you a story that's really important to communicate out into the world. So I'm just saying, as photo people, we need to be cautious and humble that we didn't get it exactly right when we talked about photographers. So protect what we want to protect, claim what we want to claim, but don't think that we came from a perfect, immaculate place and AI was the bad place. It actually opens up the arena for storytellers to have reach and to have scale, which we've never seen before. And it's going to be really interesting to see, especially who makes films, who makes TV, who makes news media at this moment when they're not reliant on these big monolithic global media consortiums to do that.
老师，我觉得呢，刚才科顿在讲到前面那个 NFT 的时候，让我想到了特别有意思的问题，就是也就是在前不久的几年前，大陆这边也是对这个 NFT，也是热议了一阵，就特别有意思。后来有什么 Web 3.0，又是元宇宙，这个增强现实，这个虚拟现实，特别有意思。你发现这几年的时间，非常短的时间，就像像电影一样，快进一样，就非常快的 过去了，对，非常有意思，对，所以我们今天呢，真的这个时代的发展是非常快的，对。关于 AI 的问题呢，这个我也是，也在思考。我觉得现在也是一切都没有定论。对，这个刚才姜蓉老师对那些个问题也都是非常的有这个给我们一些思考性。那个科顿讲的也都是，非常的有思考性。但是我呢，这个我觉得实际上还有一个我想到的问题是什么呢？就是除了这个 AI，它与这个摄影与我们使用影像，这样的一个关系之外，实际上呢，给我还有一个启发，就是因为它是人类意识、人类的大脑的一种外挂。那么呢，但它又不同于人类大脑，它跟我们人类的意识又不一样。那么我们通过它，就像照了我们自己的一个镜子一样，反而能够通过它，能反观更加的理解我们人类自身的一个思维方式，一个这个，对，是我们如何如何的。如果没有它作为一个参照，我们可能对我们自己没有像以往这么，没有那个像以往一样，没有对像今天这样那么清晰。对，这是一个问题。还有一个问题呢，与其说 AI 未来呢，对不光是未来，就包括今天以及未来对这个摄影，有哪些个改变，以及将来这个它与摄影到底还算不算摄影，它是不是这些个发展，那么我觉得还有一个呢，我们非常应该思考的问题。就是它不仅仅是对一个媒介的改变，实际是更对于我们认知整个这个整个认知我们自己认知方式的一个改变，就是我们的思维方式，我们这整个的思维的结构会因此而发生重大的改变，包括我们对世界、对物理世界，对这个对虚拟的世界，对我们自身的想象的世界，都会有一个改变，甚至对我们自己的意识的这种整个的认知方式过程都会有一个重大的改变。对，我觉得这个也是个非常重要的。好，那么接下来呢，我们请郭森老师这个向这个克顿女士这个提出她的问题。好，请郭森。
Okay, I'm really glad to have the chance to talk with you. Also glad to hear you're not a technological pessimist. AI has now become something that almost everyone discussing photography has to deal with, and over the past few months, I think we've ended up asking nearly every guest we invited a question about AI, though without any deliberate planning. And I'll be doing my research at King's with Prof. Joanna Zilinska, and we are in the Digital Humanities Department. I'm not sure if you've heard of her.
Yeah,
And
I have.
that's great. And and my research scope, I think, will also be related to AI, AI security, AI ethics, and photography, etc. Things like that. And as Mr. Zhang Rong just said, your opening remarks were really touching. It was the same for me. And photography or art is about connecting with each other and how we connect. Um, this this seemed to have become even more urgent today.
Yeah.
You know, some of your rhetoric reminded me of Wolfgang Tillmans. He's also made some political posters before. Those posters, they were made in about 2016 in response to Brexit.
Yeah.
And he used, as you know, he used a lot of his own images of like skies, clouds, and horizons, etc. Also with no recognizable nationalist iconography. And research and efforts, I think, for community, is always grounded in the awareness of precarious life. So I think they are also about how to connect us with each other and how to protect the community we share. So I think I can let me get to my question. And I want to go back in an earlier work of yours, the book Jerome said. My first question is about the specific book was Without Pictures. And in 2007, you responded to Christopher Bedford. His essay, the title maybe called something like Qualifying Photography as Art.
Yes.
And in that piece, you cited Louis Ball's idea about the art was cyclical fascination or something like that with photography, which means the enthusiasm comes around every 30 or 40 years, and each time it barely remembers what the last round built up. You also pointed out that the most essential qualities inside photography itself. I think things like, for example, ambiguity, accidents, and contingency, something like that. Those are exactly the hardest ones for contemporary art discourse to accept. So, you know, this year is today is 2026, sorry, and 20 years on. Photography's position in contemporary art feels more, I think, more secure than ever. And I'm wondering, do you think that security came at the cost of those qualities? Or put another way, to get photography into contemporary art, do we have to give something up? This is my question. Thank you.
That's a gorgeous question, and forgive me for not. I haven't read the essay Conversation with Christopher for a long time, but I remember it because he's now director of San Francisco MoMA, but at the time he and I were both curators at LA County Museum of Art, and I thought he was very brave as a contemporary art curator to have that kind of tussle with me, who in many ways the rest of the world couldn't really see the difference between Christopher Bedford and me, but we felt a profound difference in our relationship with photography that was being played out in many big institutions. That the contemporary art department had the larger budgets, so they bought the Andreas Gursky's, they bought the Wolfgang Tillmans, and then the photo department in a large museum would buy the Doug Dubois, or just like this other side of photography. So there was a lot of contradictions that on a personal level, we all understood that photography meant something different within contemporary art. And for those of us who came from photography, we thought it was a very two-dimensional understanding of photography that was going on within contemporary art. So I think that you're correct that something got secured over the last 20 years. Which I would say pretty much everybody collected, every photographer or artist using photography who was collected by contemporary departments of major museums in the 2000s, the 2010s, remains important within that canon. They probably don't sell as much as they did back then because, of course, what has happened in this cyclical world of photography is right now there is less interest in the market value of photography. I mean, even photography by people who've entered the canon of contemporary art. So while photography to a certain extent did get established within the idea of contemporary art, not all of it, and a lot has fallen away. And I would say some of that is the political conservatism or hesitancy of institutions at this particular moment in terms of which artists they engage with, particularly given that a lot of that collecting, I'm thinking particularly in America, a lot of the collecting by museums was done via committees of wealthy individuals who gave money to the institution and helped decide, that their money would be used to buy particular artists. So there's a fashionability in that collecting, which I think in this, quite mercurial political moment means, I think, less work by non-white artists or queer artists is going to be bought and added to this canon. So I don't think it's a wide terrain. I think it is still a very small, reined-in platform within contemporary art that recognizes photography as art, but also it's decreasing at this moment. It's getting more cautious and there is less investment in this. Like, I've never seen a time where you've had artists who are my age, so in their 50s, who were like the first generation to be able to make a living from selling prints. There's very few people left in that category now. So I would say it's both uncontested, but it's also on decline and becoming a smaller platform at this moment.
Okay. Yeah, you mentioned political conservatism or hesitancy of institutions. That reminds me of the British documentary photography tradition, which around in 1917, and it's very, very different from the American one.
Yeah.
When new documentary photography emerged in Britain, I think there were a lot of institutional factors involved, as well as state funding, and that was basically a project-based system funded by the state, by the UK government, and where the money comes from is always a key question.
Yeah.
Thank you for your response, and I'll turn the floor over to moderator 张策。张策老师。
好，对，我正好呢，这个接着郭深老师的这个问题呢，正好我也想到了一个特别有趣的问题，就是呢，这个我们知道，这个当这个摄影这个作为一种媒介进入到当代艺术这样的一种发展的脉络之后，并不是所有的摄影都这个进入到这个脉络。对，就是这个书也写的也是很明确，对吧？作为当代艺术的照片，这个是没问题的，这个我觉得是没有问题的。但是呢，我想到了一个非常有趣的问题，就说呢，因为当代艺术本身就有一种非常的重要的一个特质，就是它总是要把一个不是艺术的变成艺术，总是把一个对这个已有的艺术之外的一个东西变成就是它当代艺术的发展就是不断的挑战把这个挑战这个作为当代艺术的边界，作为对自身的一个挑战。那么我想到了一个非常有趣的问题，那么就说，那么以后这个当代艺术摄影有没有可能把以前那些个不是当代艺术的、不属于当代艺术摄影，也有可能转化为当代艺术摄影的一部分？有没有这种可能？这是我想到一个非常有趣的问题，我正好也跟着这个问题，对这个问一下这个科顿女士，谢谢。
政策老师，你能不能够具体举一下例子，哪些是属于你刚才提到的非当代艺术的摄影？
比如说吧，这个比如说就是因为我的一个好朋友嘛，安德烈胡耶，他就分得非常清楚。他说，一个是作为摄影师的艺术，一个是呢作为艺术家的摄影。 那么那个做当代艺术的这个摄影，肯定是作为艺术家的摄影，对，它是沿着当代艺术的脉络这么发展下来的。那么我想问的是呢，有没有可能以往的摄影师的艺术，最后经过经过这样一种因为它永远是要反自身的边界的嘛，就是有没有可能其中的一部分将来也有可能转到这个艺术家的摄影里，有没有这种可能？这是我想到一个很有趣的问题。啊，谢谢。
That's a really good question. I'll give you one anecdote from my early life as a curator at the Victoria and Albert Museum. So back in the 1990s, one of my jobs was to go into the big storage of photographs wearing like a jumpsuit because it was so dirty, and go through boxes that had come out of the library in the 19th and early 20th century. There were like hundreds of thousands of photographs in the V&A's collection. So we were still in the 90s just looking in the boxes to see what was there. And on a really, really good day, you would find a photograph by Eugene Atget, which Atget had sold to the museum in the early 1900s as examples of metalwork in Paris. And they'd been dry mounted on card and slotted into a filing cabinet in the library. And then so every time we found an Atget, we'd like, hooray! And then we'd go and have lunch and celebrate finding a work of art in all of these filing cabinets. So my kind of immediate reaction to your question is yes, I think that anything could enter into this retrospective rethinking about what constituted contemporary art photography at this moment. So if you're asking me what my definition of contemporary art photography is within the book, my definition was, so remember, I was in my early 30s when I wrote that book. It was my second book. And what I knew was that I was growing up with the first generation of young people, mainly women, going to MFA programs in Europe who were determined to be artists. That was no longer a question about whether this was a vocational training. They were making pictures that would go into galleries. And so my interest was in the motivations of that, really led by my own generation. So as you notice with the photograph as contemporary art, they're not traditional art history genres. So there isn't landscape and still life and portraiture. It's these categorizations which I learnt from makers. It's about the motivations of artists. And I don't think I was that clever at the time, but in hindsight, that is what has given the book its longevity. It wasn't trying to say in an academic or a semantic sense, what is the terrain of contemporary art photography? It was saying, look what I have learnt from the people who are actually making the most interesting things at this moment. The most difficult choice I had to make in writing that book was how far back in the history of photography I needed to go to give some grounding to what I was about to say about what young photographers were making at that point. And I made my own decision based on my politics, but also the conversations I had with artists, like who from the history of photography did they talk about, right? Nobody talked about Robert Frank. Nobody talked about Cartier-Bresson. They talked about Cindy Sherman and Louise Lawler and James Welling, etc. And so they determined where the history started for me. So I would say, I would trust your source. Who brings into the idea of photography as contemporary art other people who we did not consider in that category at the time? If it's artists who are saying, look, I never got the chance to talk about how much the conversations I was having with this artist really impacted or if it's theorists who are thinking about the wider movements of image, environment, and culture. If it was a dealer who's telling you that this should be included in that, I would be suspicious. Or a collector, I would be really suspicious, because it has, I think that's the fault line of contemporary art photography, is it can look like art, but that's production values rather than what I think defines it as art, which is the motivations of the maker.
好，谢谢科顿女士。我觉得刚才科顿女士对提到了一点，我觉得特别重要，就是动机。对，就是这个为什么？对，就是你的动机。而这个动机之所以重要，也恰恰是我们艺术家跟 AI 的一个最本质的区别。因为 AI 本身它的动机是人类输出的指令，而不是它自己的一个动机。对，我觉得这非常重要的。是。好，下面仍然有请江荣老师提问。好，江荣老师请。
谢谢赞策老师。Yes, Charlotte, I have been listening very attentively about what you have been sharing with us, especially the 5 challenges you posted just now, which you think are really the challenges that all of us, including the artists, critic, and the curators, and needs to think about. One of them is about whether we should promote human agency rather than reduce human agencies in the face of AI-generated images. So that brought me back to the interview I had with you 10 years ago. And I remember you mentioned during the interview that back in the age of digital photography, when digital photography first came out in the 90s of the last century, we were all talking about not only the death of photography, but also we were talking about whether digital technology can be creative or not. And you were talking about the motivations of the artist as the most important basis of defining whether a piece of art is a contemporary art or not. And that also, reminds me of the word intentionality. I think intentionality and motivation can be the synonyms. And that's why when Stephen Shaw created his bodies of work, American Services, using very simple camera and then just output it on the 5x7 prints and then posted 3 rows on the gallery wall using Scotch tape. At that time, a lot of people were not able to appreciate it. But then, because of his intentionality of creating that bodies of work, which really looks like family snapshot, but then they are not family snapshot. They are contemporary art at that time. And even today, we think that bodies of work is very important. So now I also try to think about whose work is interesting or can be regarded as creative art or contemporary art in this age of AI-generated images. So that reminds me of Trevor Paganan's work or Vito Steria's work. I think both of them are the front runners of the AI-generated image. So if we look at Trevor Paganan's work about surveillance art, surveillance machinery, or surveillance generated images, or the drone generated image, I remember looking at one of his work, which at the first look looks very sublime. It is just like an image of the sunset, the beautiful sunset. But then when I have a closer look, I notice there is a very small things, very tiny things in the middle of the cloud. And actually that is drone. That is the drone using by US military army to have a practice of how they can drop, the small bomb onto the ground, hitting the target of the enemy army. And then that brought me to have a second look of the work. And then next to this still image, there was a video which shows how the American army using this small bomb to kill the enemy on the ground without any sounds. It's silent video. So that really, make me think about all this technology being used in the contemporary, warfare, as we are witnessing today, virtually on TV or in the news. So that is how an artist like Trevor Pagnon, have been creating, and I think that can be created. That can be regarded as creative in my eyes. So I'm curious. I'm just curious. So far, you haven't really, shared with us an example of someone who is, creating some interesting artwork in the face of AI generated, culture. I know maybe you are hesitant to share with us, as you said, you still are very cautious about, giving some definition or, to a certain bodies of work. But I'm really curious if you can share with us any artwork that you think is interesting so far over the past 10 years.
Yeah, I'm going to answer it. I mean, it'll be slightly sideways, so forgive me, but I will tell you what is interesting me at the moment. Before I do that, I should also say that, as you can tell, I'm not an academic. I definitely am not an academic, so I don't gather things together for an argument to be made, like this is good, this is bad, this is AI, this is the consequences of AI being part of this massive shift in the way that we create and the way that we communicate and the way that we read as well. So that's not quite, I lived through that, and I do believe we live in a time where the anecdotal, so what our own personal experience is very much part of our intellectual understanding of what is happening. So there's a hesitancy because, my experiences are very personal at the moment. I'm dealing with the death of my mother. I'm dealing with spending a lot of time here in the Cotswolds, which is close to Fairford, which is this place where the drones are being sent into Western Asia at the moment by the American military. And the protesters tend to be older people, Quakers. So you're getting mass arrests of people in their 70s and 80s protesting the drones going out from this peaceful place full of birdsong at this moment. So I can summon Trevor Paglen into my world right now, which is both a very historic place, which has beautiful sunsets and landscapes, but actually it has warplanes, making the windows rattle going overhead at the moment. So I stay very much in the anecdotal with this, but also, and rather than the art historical picking artists, as you can also tell, I am very cautious at saying anointing status in a market economy to artists. But let me answer your question. So on the one hand, I want to go back to the Society for Photographic Education to tell you what I learnt from sitting in all of these presentations by students and educators and combinations of both, who had chosen the subject of collaboration as their major theme at this conference, although it had shifted more into bearing witness and in a time of genocide during the course of their organising. And I saw bodies of work, a photographer in Texas who's photographing the building of detention centres, ICE detention centres. I saw the work of a photographer or I heard about the work of a photographer who was busy organizing the conference of the building of the AI kind of generative storage center just outside Memphis, which has major complications in terms of, obviously, you're talking both the environment as well as warmongering, as well as deindustrialization. So I was seeing a woman doing these incredible photographs of wildfires, like somebody who's really reading their local landscape through the fires and the journey of the fires and the aftermath of the fires. And so I was just seeing bearing witness on a scale that is really complicated to acknowledge. And equally, I should say that from 2020 to 2024, I was the artistic director setting up a photography biennial in Qatar, in the Gulf, and setting up project grant awards to photographers in North Africa and Western Asia, and not doing it in this sort of art history or kind of looking for artists way or a particularly Western idea. It was really, what are you making? And I was seeing, like, conservation projects in Iraq. Like, I didn't, forgive my ignorance, but I didn't know that there are photographers bearing witness in an absolutely classical way. And I learnt what photography does. I was in a country which has Al Jazeera and Euronews, so I was meeting visual storytellers from across the region and learning about what their personal projects were. So I would say that what has happened to me in the 2020s is I have returned to this idea of photography bearing witness in terrible times for lots of different reasons, whether it's war or environment or persecution of particular groups. Like, I was working with 3 young photographers who at the time were living in Cox's Bazar, Rohingya refugees, the largest refugee camps in Bangladesh, them documenting their own lives there. And amazing photographs. And of course they're amazing because they were done on iPhones, and everybody knows how to take a great picture. So I'm really juggling with this idea of what criteria you would set for impactful images made by humans, right? And AI is something to do with that, but it's not to do with that either. It's something very pure and photographic as well. So that's what I would say I am learning at this moment, is to come back to that idea that, listen, it may not be important now. It may not be important in the Whitney Biennial. It might not be important in the Venice Biennial at this moment, but the work is being made, and I should be in readiness to really work collectively to make sure that that isn't forgotten in this moment of, dazzling AI prospects and hallucinations. The second way I will answer that question is, how do you deal with, storytelling and photography in this time of AI, and AI in a very broad sense, that it is impacting on the profound areas of life which have very little to do with image making, or image making is ancillary to the main action. So my second story is anecdotal, which is, I have a twin sister and her field is mental health work. And from the position of the mental health workers and their labour. And she has published a book this year, which I highly recommend, called Uber Therapy, which is looking at the role of text-based and AI-based therapy in our human mental health, but also the idea of work and why therapy would be an area, because it's not organized in a labor sense particularly well, has just crumbled in the face of these large corporations using text-based therapy, where you get to swipe and like and your therapist, rather than doing the hard work of therapeutic work. So I live in a context where I read much more broadly about AI, not as an art history project, but as a social game changer on human agency. And so I've always been less interested in image making that illustrates this moment in technology. Like I was never really interested in photography that spoke to the image environment online but brought it into a gallery. I'm much more interested in the artists you're interested in, who are actually really working out conceptually what this means and what we are looking at, like Trevor Paglen or Ito Stayel. And then my third anecdote for you is I've just published a book, a 2-volume book with the photographer Jess T. Dugan called Love Pictures, which is essentially a monograph of Jess, who's in their early 40s and is one of the standout, very classical portraitists of LGBTQ and especially trans and gender non-conforming communities so far across America, although I do hope that they get to work much more broadly. And the book is based around a 5-day conversation that me and Jess had in St. Louis, which is their home, about love, responsibility, family, photography, cultural institutions, which then became this skeleton of a conversation that's their work, their photographs is structured against. So instead of the bodies of work that they have created, it was thematically how the work reconfigures around a conversation between two people who care profoundly about the future and the responsibility of photography in these uncertain times. And the second volume is a series of 15 conversations with the people that we summoned into the room of our conversation. And it's everyone from Jess's mum to long-time collaborators who sit for portraits with Jess, through to their big influences, Dawood Bey, who taught them, Cassiope, who Jess is coming to know, but I've worked with a lot over the last 10 years. And so it's a series of interviews of people in the way that if I had mentioned a friend who's a photographer today, I'd probably email them afterwards and say, were your ears burning? Because I was talking about you today and it made me think. And I want to ask you a question today, which is based on this other conversation I'm having. Anyway, I'm telling you this partly to confuse you into remembering what your question was to me, but also to tell you that I've been really busy thinking about AI in a very meta level, rather than saying it's this artist or this artist. I'm living it like you, and I will reserve judgment on what art history and contemporary art institutions will do with this. I hope they do better than they did with post-internet practices or NFTs. I hope they do better than they with AI.
Thank you. I think I can give the floor back to the moderator, 郑策老师。
好，谢谢科顿女士。刚才科顿在讲到那个心理咨询的时候，让我想到了一个非常有趣的一个例子。对，大陆的一个艺术家呢，也做这个AI 的，做 AI 艺术的。他呢曾经有一个作品，是让也是关于心理咨询这方面的。他是让这个 AI 呢当这个心理医生，为这个参观者就有什么，就是这个观众啊有什么心理问题，通过 AI 呢来给他解答。然后当时我就说，如果是我的话，我要做一个相反的事情，让 AI 充当患者，充当那个有心理问题的人。然后呢，让观众为他来解答。为什么呢？因为非常的 是因为什么？我非常清楚，对，因为这个作为一个心理医生，他之所以能够为这个来访者解答心理问题，实际是他首先把这个来访者的问题共情于他自己的这个体验，共情于他自己的这个，对，他要先经过自己的这个经历或者什么，他才能够回答这个问题。那么实际上他在回答这个来访者的问题时候，他实际已经把自己先治愈了。对，所以所以呢，这个对，所以我觉得，如果让这个 AI 去这个模仿这个来访者的角色，把他们角色对调一下的话，那么可能呢，这个事情会变得更有趣，而且对于这个咨询的人来讲，可能帮助会更大，因为他在回答 AI 的问题的时候，实际他已经把自己的问题给解决了，这是特别有意思的一个事情。对，还有一个刚才科顿讲的时候呢，对对，还有刚才科顿讲的时候呢，我也这个想到一个问题，就是说，AI 与这个艺术家的关系，绝不是说它只是我们这个我们使用的一个工具，对，就是我们用一个 AI 来做我们的一个想要做的作品，它实际是更是呢与 AI 的一种博弈。就是说，它实际是呢，这个因为 AI 呢不具有身体，不具有我们
Yeah.
艺术家的身体，它没有我们的感知，而我们这个人类的感知呢，实际有很多呢，我们是不知道的，就是我们身体的感知实际是非常的丰富，像海洋一样。而这个我们人类的大脑能够给分析处理的，就像那个涓涓的细流一样，这两个之间是有巨大的鸿沟，是不成比例的。而这个 AI 呢，它恰恰是那个能处理的地方像海洋一样，而它感知的地方没有。没有，对，所以呢，这个正好对倒过来。那么你要用一个AI 来处理你的你的那个非常少的那个涓涓细流的地方，那显然是这个那永远在说一个正确答案式的东西，或者是作为一个他把你的一个已经显影的一个想法做得更精细，我觉得这个是没有意思的。对，这一个真正的 AI 艺术家，恰好应该是你的感知让 AI 一个锻炼，就是让 AI 的那个程序暴露它自身。对，然后我们才知道哦，一个外在于不同于我们人类的这个大脑思维和感受的这样的一种机器的思维，它的这个是怎么回事，而不让它过度的自动化，让我们看起来一切都是那么自然而然，这样的话就没有意思了，就不再是一个提问式的，对，而是一个说是把我们的已有的答案润色的更完美、更自动化的一个东西了。对，这是我对这个 AI 的一个大概其的一个想法。我也想听听科顿怎么看这个问题。
You are a really brilliant mix of a deep thinker and you're funny as well. So thank you very much for bringing all of yourself to that response. I think you're onto something. The idea, because AI is such a mechanism of conflict avoidance, it's the complete opposite of what therapy should be, right? Like it would make a terrible patient. I mean, it would make a worse therapist, but it would make a terrible patient because it would never get angry or upset. It would just stop computing or not understand what's going on. I really like the idea that that human beings really are. The challenge is I don't use off-the-shelf AI anymore, really, because I'm working with tools that are much more about my human agency, and I really resent the idea of prompting and instructing, because when we prompt and instruct, most of us have to change who we are. We have to adapt ourselves in order to get an understanding out of AI. And in political and gendered terms, I find that really annoying that I have to yet again change who I am and change my context in order to get this machine to do something for me. It's also transactional, isn't it? I mean, which is the death of deep human emotion is the transactional nature. And as you say, the gaming that stands in for actual relationality. So there's a lot of challenges because, of course, also at the moment, it's like candy. It's like it's magic, the way that it seems to understand enough of you, and you forget how much labor you've put into being understood by this automated process. So, and also in the world of therapy, it's a real problem if your success criteria for your online therapist, your AI therapist, is whether they agree with you or whether they like you or make you feel better. I mean, therapy is not really supposed to be any of those things, is it? So, yeah, it's a profound profound disconnect. And in this period of time, it'll be really interesting to see how much we forget that we need to then remember about what makes us human and what we actually need in this time of getting quick answers and quick summaries and being able to give instruction and get something back without any confrontation. Yeah.
好的，谢谢科顿，谢谢。下面还由这个国森老师继续提问。好的，国森请。
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. AI's performance in terms of therapy and harm. I think it is definitely very complex because sometimes I feel it's really two sides of the same coin. The real problem, I think, it isn't what it says, but how it says it. And because it interacts with users, I think essentially reflects how the users is being treated. And I was going to ask another AI related question, but I think talking about AI nonstop will wear us out. So I'd rather go back to this book of contemporary art. In the introduction to this book, I remember you wrote about democracy and resistance in photography, and the general idea that art photographers, the consciously resisting the mainstream uses of photography. And while following its fundamental democratic nature, but today the most direct expression of photography's democratic quality is social media and everyday phone snapshots. A lot of snapshots by our smartphones like iPhone, and that's what billions of people do every day. And that seems to fall exactly under what you call mainstream uses. However, I didn't find this passage in the third edition Chinese translation. I haven't had a chance to check in English version, but or I'm not sure if you added it when writing the fourth edition or if it got cut for translation reasons. It appears at the end of the third paragraph of the introduction. So my question is twofold. First, first I would like to know, did you add it in the fourth edition, and why? And second, how should we understand this idea of art photography resisting mainstream uses? What kind of democratic quality are they maybe the guardian? Yeah, this is my question.
Yeah, so each of the 4 editions of the Photographer's Contemporary Art have a completely different introduction. And the 4th edition is the most radical reworking of the whole book since it was first published in the mid-2000s. for editions 2 and 3, I wasn't able to change the original chapters. I could add chapters. So that's what you've probably got within edition 3 is like an additional post-internet chapter and a new introduction trying to cover a new introduction. And I would say that I struggled with the introductions in all 4 versions, partly because of my nature that I get really anxious at the idea of being somebody who's going to give the official kind of introduction to the official history of contemporary art photography. And I would say that also I mean, like, as you said, it's really interesting that you mentioning social media as your question to stop us from going on the track about AI is like, yeah, we were in that same position with social media, weren't we? That it was like you had to talk about that as something that was radically shaping that was like part of the context that was shaping the image environment into which there is this platform called the photographs as contemporary art. And now we're in a place where, is there a case to say, is AI that new context that we have to bring into the language we use to describe this platform called the photograph as contemporary art? And I would say that with social media, I think because so much of what's in the book is not directly related to the narrative of social media. It's related to the longer term narratives of what photography does as a media form, which has been around for the whole of the 20th century as well. So, for example, you could make a case to say that post-internet photographic contemporary art is as much to do with the image explosion of the avant-garde 1910s and how artists reacted to their version of the image explosion as it is to social media. That there's like 2 cultural forces, which is about essentially different moments in the mapping of image explosions. And for me, that's ultimately that's what I took social media to be. Not so much, you couldn't really see how gaming was going to be a big part of it, or kind of interaction with images. The 2 big factors of social media was it was an image explosion, and it wasn't the first one that photography as art or art had dealt with. So I think I stuck pretty much to that, so that really it was about what contemporary art photographers were doing in relation to their image explosion, but also referencing art history from Cubism onwards. And then the question is would I do that differently now because the AI is much bigger. AI is much bigger than image making in social media. It's bigger than Instagram. Like, I'm really glad I didn't align my idea of photography as contemporary art entirely to Instagram as this kind of unbreakable, column in the story of contemporary art photography, because I think it will go. I mean, I almost feel it now, right? It's like, well, it's lasted longer than a lot of things, but it's not going to last that long. And that's the time that we live through. So yeah, I don't think I'm adequately answering that question, but I was cautious about going straight into, and look, you can see it on your phone. It was like, oh, I don't actually think that was the point in terms of what was going on within the work, the contemporary art photography I was looking at.
，Thank
谢
you，
谢柯敦。
谢谢你。
对，这个问题也是非常有意思的问题。也是今天咱们讨论的一个非常有趣的问题，就说社交媒体呢本身在我看来呢，应该它不属于当代艺术的这个范畴，但是呢，它不等于不能进入，对它这个只要我们能从中发现一个有趣的问题，对我觉得 是它也是可以进入到我们这个当代艺术的一个议题的。对，郭森还有什么问题继续吗？
我想澄清一下，因为我感觉似乎科顿，我刚刚的表述让他有一些误解。
好的，好的，你继续继续把你再把话我再接过来。好了，
So thank you for such a detailed response. And um, before I turn the floor to moderator over to moderator, I think I might not have been clear enough with my question just now.
Okay.
What I was trying to ask about isn't strictly just social media, but something we could call the consequences of the democratization of photography, which means does art resist this? Does art resist the consequences of
Yeah.
democratization of photography? Because I noticed that the word democracy, it appears almost only this once in the entire book. So
Yeah.
this is a question.
Oh, interesting. I'm sorry. Yes, I didn't cotton on to that.
Okay.
But that's a really, really good question. Yes, I don't think that photography as contemporary art is a democracy. Is that what you were asking me?
Um, what I'm focusing on is the relationship between art and democracy, because you
Yeah.
used a specific word, resistance or resist. Um, mm,
Yeah. I mean, I would say, yeah, no, art is not a democracy, and I don't think it can carry through on the idea of democracy. I just don't. And I think you see that in probably about the time that I was writing the third edition was when you saw in the big biennials or triennials a much more kind of politicized version of photography, which might appear next to a painting, but it brought you into the real world. Like the Arab Spring could appear in photographs in a biennial, right? It could just because photography, of course, can do the job of like taking something that's happening right now into a gallery context. And I mean, in different moments of crisis in history, photography has functioned as a way of visualizing or kind of culturally gifting something that's happening in the real world and making you pay attention to it. And you could say that even Trevor Paglen essentially makes you pay attention to something that's actually happening in the real world through a gallery experience. So I don't want to completely underestimate the fact that art can do that, but it's a bit like humor. It's very rare that it works. Very rare. I think the bit when I was writing the third edition, I was just remembering the way that photography was instrumentalized in cultural spaces as a way of acknowledging what was happening in the real world, often driven, like the Arab Spring, by an understanding in social media and what we were calling citizen journalism at the time. And before major surveillance and restrictions came in, that we kind of like citizen journalism disappeared. So there was a moment where there was a connection, which I think was in the third edition. But I'm pretty certain I didn't use the word democracy in the fourth edition, which was in 2000.
Yeah, you give me a very precise response, and I agree with you. And the changes between the fourth and three editions are really significant, because the fourth edition added an entire chapter on photographicness.
Yes.
I really hope it can be translated into Chinese as soon as possible. So let me turn the floor over to moderator 桑老师，可以了。
好，好，谢谢科顿。那么对，我正好也想呢，这个提问一个非常有趣的问题。那么是科顿呢，关于在这个摄影如魔术这个前言里提到的一个非常好的一个问题。科顿讲呢说这个摄影如魔术。 但是呢，这个真正的这个魔术，不是在这个魔术师的这个手上发生的，而是在这个观看者、这个观众的大脑里头，以想象的形式发生的。对，我呢觉得呢这个问题呢，我是非常的赞同，也非常的有兴趣。因为呢，因为我们关于这个问题讨论了很多年了，从这个神经科学，从认知哲学，对，讨论很多年，就说艺术的秘密呢就在大脑，对，它实际是因为没有观看者，这个魔术是不可能发生的。这个问题是非常好的。但是我呢还有一个问题我特别感兴趣，就是关于想象。这个徐斌，你把我那个第一页那个打开一下，让科顿比较更容易理解。对，因为呢，这个从神经科学的角度讲，这个想象实际跟知觉在这个大脑活动里是一个区域，就是它是具有重合的。也就是说，我们看到一个什么东西和我们想到在大脑里想象一个东西，实际就脑科学来讲，它有很大的重合性。对。也就是说，想象实际是很重要的。就是说，而且我们看到之前，实际就已经在想象，就是说，实际看到是在回应我们这个想象的那个预测。而且想象呢，这个也在我看来也分很多，也是不一样的。你比如说那种我们在这个观看的时候这种想象。它可能是更类似于一种这种意识清醒状态下的想象，这是一种就是我们看到一个东西，想象了我们大脑的一个经验，它像一个有这个脚本一样的这么一个剧情的一个想象。那么实际还有一个想象，我觉得也非常的重要，就是那种拉康精神分析学里讲的那种，或者是那种精神分析讲那种。无意识的想象，比如说那种睡梦中的那种，他把一个不同的东西给合成了啊，这种想象可能对于艺术来讲呢更重要，因为它是一种无意识的，就是不是那种按照脚本进行的，虽然它也是按照语言的那个句法规则来的，但是来讲这个材料是超出了我们这个逻辑和我们这个日常的这种这种日常经验的。这是我的一点想法。我想呢，请科顿女士就想象这个问题，对这个再深入的讲一讲。我觉得这个问题非常有趣。好，谢谢。
It's very perceptive of you. I share your belief in two systems dancing together in the magic of photography. I was quite persistent with the analogy of close-up magic for this book. So it's not the theatre illusion of magic, but it's this sleight of hand of a magician working with their hands. And the way that, there's both the very logical process of magic with hands, the sleight of hand of magic, which is a very basic principle. Like, you've got like that Ace of Diamonds card, and they put it in the pack, and you shuffle it, and then somehow that card's there. And so the person who's watching that, the audience, is like, okay, how did they do that? And I'm going to watch really intently the second time that they do that. So the magician says, okay, I'm just going to show you again what I did. So he takes the Ace of Diamonds, puts it into the pack, shuffles it, asks the person to cut the card, they cut it, and there it is, the Ace of Diamonds. And you're like, human beings want patterns. There's a logic, there's a pragmatism to understanding what is happening. So that's your daydream, right? Is the very pragmatic. Well, how do I do this? How do I get the money to do what I want to do? How do I turn this situation into this image? Or how do I give form to this idea? So that's all of the kind of beautifully human power of our imaginations, but also the logic of how we see things and how we give form to ideas. So so the magician seemingly keeps hiding this card and finding it, and every time I'm like, okay, I'm just going to pay attention, even more attention, and understand what is happening. And then by like the third time or the fourth time, I just have to give it up. I have to experience the wonder of this magic, right? Which I think is your second form of imagination, which is I just feel the wonder of this, of being human, of having an imagination. And I used to go, I live in Los Angeles, and I used to go to the Magic Castle, which is like the magicians club. It's where magicians perform to magicians. And it's where the idea of photography as magic really came to me. And every time I had a photographer visiting or an artist visiting, I'd take them with my friend Mary to the Magic Castle. And there was a moment that I remember which totally embodied that, which was I took the photographer Philip Lorca de Corsia, who I was working on a solo show at LA County Museum, who's the most sophisticated, arched, funny, controlled, amazing person. And I looked at him and I saw the wonder happen for him. And it was like meeting 5-year-old Philip Lorca de Corsia. It was like I understood him at that moment as he faced this wonder where he just gave himself up to this kind of sleight of hand of magic. And for me, that is a really profound relationship that I have with this very simple tool, this very logical, pragmatic idea of photography, is that it has this wonder attached to it. And aren't human beings amazing? And what we see and what we feel and what we're able to give form to. And yeah, so that's, I think you and I relate in terms of these layers and these depths, and giving yourself over to a deeper unconscious kind of form of wonder that photography embodies.
好，谢谢科顿，这个问题非常有意思。实际想象是这个整个艺术发生学的一个非常非常重要的步骤，对，这个是非常重要的，这个我觉得特别有意思。那么这个下面我们还是有请姜蓉老师继续。好的，姜蓉老师，请。
好，谢谢主持人赞策老师。我想时间也差不多了，我现在可能想问一个比较关于未来、关于当下我们最应该面对的一个问题，也就是哦I don't know why I'm speaking in Chinese, but I can turn it over to English. Anyway, so I think given the time that it's almost 10 o'clock, so I would like to ask you a final question, which is related not only to the future of photography, but also to the future of the present. As you said just now, future is yours, and I would say that the future is also now. Right. So it's a question really about your, you know, one of the challenges you posted just now is how photography can bear witness during this very troubled time, a very divided time, a very politicized time, and also full of disinformation and misinformation.
Yeah.
Because of AI as well, that it makes the whole time we are experiencing much more complicated. That's why people like Frank Richardson, who is so adamant about how photography can bear witness because
Yeah.
of flaw created by AI. So at the same time, I really want to give credit to the photojournalists who are working around the world, risking their life to bring back, the images of the war, the conflicts, and the images of the people who are dying of hunger in Sudan and other places of the world. Because of those photojournalists that we are able to know in our peaceful time what is the suffering that people are going through in the other part of the world.
Yeah.
But then photojournalism is a different category of photography from the fine art photography. Those are the two separate photography, including documentary photography, long-term projects of documentary photography, which is also very important. But then we also think that what Walker Evans said, that photographic style photography is also very important. And so then the question is really about the difference between the medium of photography and the other mediums. And I think we all agree that the medium of photography is really about the relationship between, photography and the real world. That is the specificities of photography as a medium, as opposed to painting. Painting and other mediums are more subjective. The photography really has to come to from the real world. That is what we call the core characteristic of photography. But then, so then if the photography is really has to be related with the real world, then it is unavoidable that whatever the photographic art created by the artists or image makers have to do with social issues and political issues. So, if we look at, the work of Cindy Sherman or Jeff Wall, they have already been canonized as the two most important photographers of last century, even though they are still, creating new works. So my question to you is that how can photographers or image makers can create artwork or photographic work that is not political side, but still can touch upon social issues and social injustice and political issues? Thank you.
So even though it is now, none of us are experts on this. So this is my inexpert gut feeling in response to your question, which is if I were starting out now and wanted to have a practice, I would probably embrace the idea, which we're getting more used to, particularly with younger practitioners, which is somebody being a storyteller, right? Is you don't over-define it as photography or filmmaking. If I was to get a bit more specific in the area that I think has the greatest potency, it is about reclaiming, without any of the naysayers or institutionalized versions, documentary. In the sense that I think what photography traditionally and documentary films both have in common is these process of telling stories at a very human level, which might be vast in its context, shaped by context, that it involves footage and archival material and the reinterpretation of that, which we know that use of archives is a massive part of photography as contemporary art. Didn't quite see it coming in terms of empirically how big that would be. Rewriting histories, and obviously the reanimations of stories, whether that's the reenactment, which of course AI is very good, like potentially AI in terms of documentary filmmaking is radically interesting because you will be able to reenact. And I think photography can also engage with that as well. So I think it's about claiming what you want to claim. Claim your present, claim your future, claim your history, and tell the story. And not to be too tied up in the semantics of like who's, particularly a semantic set by institutions, which I've been calling zombie institutions apparently for like almost 15 years. Like, I don't think the institutions will give you much guidance on what sits within the platforms of either contemporary art or the most meaningful works of art. But if we focus, I think the real potency, if I were starting now, is to radically rethink documentary, and in light of the importance of telling our stories better right now. We just have to tell our stories in a better way and not be waiting around for media empires or creative industries or, creative, the controllers of tech to give us permission or give us a platform.
Beautiful answer. Thank you.
好的，这个谢谢科顿女士，对她刚才讲的非常好，对，非常有意思，对，实际上我简单说一下，我个人有一个观点，就是说摄影的真实性实际来自于这个物与物之间信息的传递，就是这个那个物体那个事件那个作为一个物体的表面的反光，那个光波与感光这个材料之间，它们之间的一个不受人干预的这样一个物理性的这个信息的传递，这个东西是真实的。但是呢，我们通过这么一个影像来讲述的故事，实际是严格的讲是我们人类意识虚构的一个东西。所以说，它表达的某种叙事什么是虚构的，但是就这个就这种它这种显影的方式来讲，在直接摄影里是真实的。但是呢，将来在我们的 AI 的这个影像里，它就不再具备这种物的这样的一个与这个物理世界之间的这么一种对接了。所以这个我觉得可以从这样一个层面来思考。这个科顿女士讲的非常好，这个机构是不值得信任的。这个今天呢，我们这个讨论的非常好，时间又过得非常快，这个是一晃这个又马上就到时间了。这个今天呢，我觉得这个我们从这个摄影性的问题，包括这个对摄影的这个社交平台，这个这个与当代艺术的影像的关系，这个摄影如魔术，这个想象到底这个想象作为一种重要的机制的问题，包括这个 AI 在除了影像，包括这个在日常生活中，比如说心理咨询像这类的问题，都做了一个非常有趣的深入的这个探讨。对，尤其是呢，这个通过今天的这个对谈，我们对这个未来这个当代艺术影像的一个发展，对这个我们这个今天我们是不能确定的，因为它一切尚未完结，包括当代艺术本身。所以好多人都在讲当代艺术如何，实际它是个未完成时，对，它一切都在进行中。所以我们今天呢不能给它下一个定论，对，所以呢这个一切呢交给时间去回答。但是作为我们自己呢，就像这个科顿女士讲的，我们要守护我们的主体性，守护我们人类作为人类的感知，对，所以我们对它呢不能够说我们这个听之任之，说我对它要有一个认知，而不是说被它带着走，就是最后呢。不是说我们最后把我们自己也变成了一个 AI，像 AI 那样的去，对，去这个，去变得丧失了我们人类的主体性。我觉得这是一个非常这个关键的问题。对，所以我今天，真的，尤其我们今天这个第一次也是他以这个不是以录播是直播的形式，对，所以这里头也要向观众朋友们呢这个解释一下。如果大家看这个我们那个翻译的字幕啊，有这个这个不清楚啊或者困难的地方，不要紧，因为我们每次的直播呀，后面都会有文字的版，我们会把这个我们今天所有的对谈的内容都把它翻译出来，然后呢，做成一个文字版，这个大家的这个假以时日，等我们这个文字版推出来以后，大家可以更加清晰的看到了这个今天整个的这个所有的内容。好，那么今天呢，首先要感谢科顿老师，感谢江荣老师，感谢郭森老师，更要感谢呢今天呢这个在幕后对为我们付出了非常努力的这个夏静怡老师和这个提供这个技术支持的这个史阳坤老师。最后呢，更要感谢今天呢这个收看我们这个一如既往的收看我们这个直播的观众朋友，因为让我特别感动的就是上次4月21号，那一次就是我专门邀请了脑科学家 和这个英国史蒂夫大学的这个意识科学专家和这个施三维老师，我们分享了一个非常非常这个太烧脑了的这么一个直播，竟然我们的听众仍然从头到尾坚持到多少19.65万人。对，所以这个对，因为我们平时每次都是20万以上，那么真的那么烧脑的一个问题，包括那些数学公式像天书一样，最后所以这让我们非常的兴奋。所以这个我们有这么好的观众啊，这个我在此也是向这个大家这个坚持听我们直播的朋友，再一次表示呢衷心的感谢。你们的热情呢也鼓励我们，要每一期都认真啊，我们要坚持我们的学术水准，坚持我们的这种思想的前沿性。好，那么今天呢，我们的直播就到这里，这个谢谢，下期见。
Thank you.
感谢各位
Bye-bye.
老师
Thank
的
you,
精彩
everybody.
分享，也感谢大家的用心聆听。本期当代影像路径及其可能跨学科研讨摄影如魔术线上研讨圆满结束，也非常感谢各院校机构和媒体的大力支持与参与。我们期待下次再见，谢谢。